we treat the future like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological damage and technological risk, as if there was nobody there, and we need to redesign democracy for the 21st century and beyond that.
Roman Krznaric is a philosopher and a political scientist. In his recent book, The Good Ancestor, he encourages all of us to be better ancestors, so that our children's children remember us as game changers.
Why should my kids cross their fingers and hope that some public official is going to look after their interests?
Krznaric tells us to forget short-term thinking and to start thinking like cathedral builders in order to save future generations.
I found out that there's this movement, as yet has no name, and we need to name them. What I want to do is to bring them into the room and say, look, you are trying to extend our horizons beyond the here and now, beyond the tyranny of the present. The big question to think about how we're going to break out of the straitjacket of hundreds of years of short-termism. The real question is, where do we start?
Come with us on a journey through time and join the resistance of the future. Australian-born Krznaric is married to Kate Rayworth, the economist who became known for her groundbreaking theory on the donut economy. The couple lives in Oxford with their 12-year-old twins, Cass and Siri.
This tree's been here probably 850 years, since the middle of the 12th century, so it's got this timelessness to it. It's all about deep time. And, I think the way we're constantly looking at our watches all the time, we're thinking about seconds and minutes. But think about the speed at which a tree grows. I've come up with this idea of time rebels, and what that for me is about the idea of being engaged in long-term thinking, being committed to intergenerational justice, caring about the welfare of the generations to come and the planet they're going to live on. And the extraordinary thing that's been happening, I think, over the last decade or two is the emergence of a global movement of time rebels, these pioneering long-term thinkers in the fields of politics, economics, culture. They're everywhere. In a way, it's like a kind of secret revolutionary movement. People who are dedicated to thinking beyond the tyranny of the now. So one of the things we've been trying to do in our house, I guess as a family, is give ourselves a new sense of time. And one of the ways we do it is by covering over all of the clocks so that we don't have minutes and seconds ticking away and dominating our lives. We're trying to think longer term. I mean, look, just here's an example of that, where we've got a sculpture that is probably made from stone that's 190 million years old. Over here is what I think of as our slow time clock. Some of them are over 20 years old. And I think that's about getting us back in touch with longer cycles of time which we've lost touch with. And here we've got a few little things which help us rethink time as well. Like down here, okay, somebody sent me this the other day. This is an invitation to a party on the 6th of June at noon in the year 2269. Let's have a look at this. If you look closely here, this coin is from the year, not 2020, but 02020. They put a 0 in front of the date. Suddenly, you've expanded the years by tens of thousands of years. Just a tiny little change can help us rethink time itself. This is a little act of a time rebel to put a 0 in front of the year. There's this emerging movement, legal movement, activists who are campaigning for rights for future people. This is amazing. This is one of the biggest shifts in the history of rights since the French Revolution. I found out about this amazing public interest law firm in the US called Our Children's Trust, which has filed a landmark case on behalf of 21 young people who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations.
You're 11 years old and you're suing the United States government. That's not what most 11-year-olds do, right?
Yeah. I fear that I won't have a home here in the future.
That the island will be gone.
Yeah, that the island will be underwater because of climate change.
This is real David versus Goliath stuff. Like, they're not going to beat the federal government this time, but these are long-term legal struggles, like the struggles for women's rights in the United States, the struggles for civil rights. And the interesting thing I think about Our Children's Trust is that it's trying to establish a constitutional right to an ecologically better world.
In your book, you talk about political presentism. What do you mean by that?
I really think there's a kind of flaw at the center of representative democracy. And the flaw, a design problem really, is that we fail to incorporate the voices of future generations into political decision making. I think of it as political presentism, because those future generations have no rights. If I think about my kids, you know, they could easily be alive in the year 2100, and the actions that we're taking today are going to impact on the world of 2100, and they've got no say in it.
It should not be up to us to take the responsibility, but since the leaders are behaving like children, then we have no other choice.
You've got this other legal movement, the movement to give legal personhood to nature.
E rere kau mai te awa nui mai te kau I maunga ki Tangaroa. Ko au te awa, ko te awa ko au.
In Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Wanganui River, which is sacred to local Maori people, has been given the same legal rights as a person.
After 118 years of making applications to different levels of government, this is our tupuna awa. This is our ancestor.
And look, don't forget that actually in the 19th century, corporations started being given rights like people. Well, I'm glad we're moving on from that now and giving rights to rivers. Let's extend the whole idea of what rights are. The basic principle is absolutely clear that you don't foul the nest. You take care of the place that's going to take care of your offspring.
That's it. Is that human?
No, there's someone from our family. It
So
is a
it is a
human.
human.
It is a human,
that-
yes. You know what Krznaric means, of course, don't you? Son of a fur trader in Croatian, but I don't know if there were actually any fur traders in the family. Though, actually, here's something you probably didn't know. So do you know who this is here?
A person?
It's a person. So yes, it's my mother's mother, Naomi. And Naomi loved the Soviet Union because she was a member of the Communist Party, as well as being a nudist, which I'm sure you're quite glad that I have not inherited that trait. She was a nudist and a vegetarian, which
Is a bad thing.
Which is
according
me.
to you, but you are.
Wow.
Her father was the rabbi of this town in Romania, now Moldova, and during the Second World War, the Jews were rounded up in that town, and Naomi's father, the rabbi, was forced to walk at gunpoint with everyone from the town and dig their own graves, and they were murdered. So her family, almost all of them were killed in the Holocaust. We're part of that history. I guess we all are, and my children are, that's you. If you have children, their grandchildren will all be the inheritors of that history.
Yeah. Wow.
One of the things I've become absolutely aware of is the way that the culture I live in, that I've grown up in, Western culture, has become divorced from the great chain of ancestors that is common in so many other cultures. We've been taught to be individuals by neoliberal economics, by Sigmund Freud and the self-help industry, to think about me. But actually, if you turn to other cultures, there is an extraordinary richness of connection through the generations. I love that idea of this person from the past kind of being with me in a way, and this is something that exists in a deeper level in a lot of indigenous culture, the idea that your ancestors are there with you, they're kind of here in the room with you, and even also your future sisters, all those generations to come. I know future sisters isn't actually a word, but that's how I like to think of it. Ancestors, future sisters, and me. Bring everybody in here together to hear the cacophony of their voices.
Are we being good ancestors? And I pose that question because I believe that the future generations will look back upon us and judge us as to whether we have been wise or whether we have been profligate and wasteful and destructive of the opportunities for their future, as well as the future of generations to come.
So someone who's really inspired me is the great immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine back in the 1950s.
Children, bring your parents, and parents, bring your children. Get your free polio shot today at 12th and Broadway.
Back in the 50s, maybe up to 500,000 children were getting polio and dying from it every year. So his discovery was world-changing. It was a revolution in public health.
Citizens of Protection, Kansas are really getting protection. The Tots are the first to face the Salk vaccine needle. This miss isn't quite sure about the whole thing, but, well, it really wasn't so bad. Next.
He was someone who wanted to leave the polio vaccine as a gift to the generations of the future, as well as, of course, to children in the present.
Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. This is... Could you patent the sun?
And when I first heard that question, are we being good ancestors, it was like a light bulb. I suddenly thought, that is the question for our age, because it really allows us to think about so many of the impacts we're going to have on the generations to come. In a way, never before have humans had such potentially destructive consequences for the future holders, as I call them, all of those citizens of the future. And Salk's question, are we being good ancestors, really helps us think about all of those different issues which are so vital to today in an age where we live in the tyranny of the now. We know that our politicians can barely see beyond the next election or even the latest tweet. We know that businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report. We know that markets spike then crash in speculative bubbles, and that we're constantly looking at our phones, checking for updates and clicking the buy now button. We must escape the tyranny of the now, and Salk's question, at least for me, really gave us an insight into how to do that. We do it by starting to think differently about who we are in time.
Speed the work. It's a national necessity. The country must produce more in a shorter space of time if there is to be a chance of coming through our difficulties.
Let's send our mind back to medieval Europe and the invention of the clock in the 14th century. Well, the clock started measuring the hours, but by 1700, clocks started having minute hands, and by 1800, most clocks had second hands. So for hundreds of years, time has been speeding up, and the future has been coming closer and closer and closer. And then the clock became the key machine of the industrial age, that factory clock making the assembly line move. We're the inheritors of 500 years of mechanical clock time, which has helped us colonize the future. We are born into short-termism, and that's partly why it's so hard to get out of.
I remember talking to this fisherman on a boat in Lyme Regis on the south coast of England. He brought up the subject of Brexit. This was just before the vote.
Our own fleet surely has to come first. When we leave Europe, we've got to be looking at a bigger picture to get a better, sustainable fishing for our own country. Never mind these foreign lads.
And I said, well, so where are you going to vote? And he said, well, I'm voting Brexit. And I said, why? He goes, well, you know, we've got to get our country back. And I said, but you sell most of your fish to Europe, you know? And he goes, well, no, but we've got to get our country back. And, well, you know, I can understand that frustration that you're trying to make a living and it's difficult, but now I just look at the huge amount of red tape and bureaucracy which has emerged from this apparent liberation. It is about long-term thinking. It's a short-term response to Britain's immediate economic problem, and that just drives me crazy.
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow, for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two.
I believe that we've got a marshmallow brain inside us. The marshmallow brain is the part of our brain which focuses on short-term rewards and immediate gratification. Of course, it's named after that famous marshmallow test. And of course, the result was the majority of kids couldn't resist and gobbled up the snack. And this was taken as evidence that we are driven by short-term rewards and immediate gratification. It was a story we started telling ourselves about who we are as a species. But the marshmallow test is only part of who we are. I think that for most of us, there's a struggle going on in our minds between the drivers of short-term thinking and long-term thinking. I mean, do we party today or save for our pensions for tomorrow? Do we upgrade to the latest iPhone or plant a seed in the ground for posterity? And I think this struggle between the short and the long term is a struggle that goes on in our brains.
You wanted to eat it, didn't you? Yeah. So did I tell you to give you another one?
Alongside the marshmallow, there's another part of our brain. Here it is, the acorn brain. This is another part of our neuroanatomy, and it's the acorn brain which focuses on long-term thinking and planning and strategizing. And the fact is, we've all got one. It's a new part of the brain. It's only a couple of million years old. It lives here in the frontal lobe above our eyes, particularly a bit called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And the thing is that it's actually better developed in human beings than most other creatures. So, you know, a chimpanzee, right, will get a stick and strip off the leaves and turn it into a tool to poke into a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of these tools and set them aside for next week. But hey, that's exactly what human beings do. We are acorn brain thinkers. That's how we save for our pensions and write song lists for our own funerals. It's how we built the Great Wall of China and voyaged into space. So let's not just think we're short-term marshmallow snatchers. We are also long-term acorn thinkers. We have a capacity for the temporal pirouette, for our minds to dance across time. So let's all learn how to switch on that acorn brain. So here we go. This is the little titchy one.
Yeah, I like this one. That is 23 centimeters.
That's the mini one.
Yeah, that's
well, what about the big? I don't know. What about the biggie one?
One's massive. What? That's 29 centimeters.
It's a giant.
It's nearly the length of the ruler, so we won't be able to measure it. This one, 27 centimeters. They've grown so much in a month, but a month is so little in their lifetime.
You know, they're kind of like clocks, the way that they're growing incredibly slowly. Like
Yeah.
The way that outside husk opens and the way this grows. Like imagine we didn't have digital watches like you've got there, ticking away the seconds, second by second. Just got rid of those, smashed all the watches in the world, and we only
Pop
had
an acorn on my wrist.
Yeah, put an acorn on your wrist. Why not?
They're just amazing, like really, really slow clocks.
Madam Speaker, one of the first things I did on entering Parliament was buy a watch. And since then, I have been shackled to the system. I've been cuffed to the prison bars of time, or at least the prison that we make of time. This arbitrary Roman calendar disconnects us from the natural rhythms of life and of the planet. And so today, I remove that shackle because when I look at the state of our rivers, our atmosphere and our people, I don't need a watch to tell me what time it is.
it's a big question to think about how we're going to break out of the straitjacket of hundreds of years of short-termism. The real question is, where do we start? And one place to start is with, I think, the culture of time that we're embedded in, the idea of deep time. Because there's this new idea which has emerged over the last 200 years, that's new in my sort of thinking, which is the idea that the Earth is millions, billions of years old. I mean, before the 18th century, at least in Western culture, the idea was that the Earth was maybe 6,000 years old. That's when God created the Earth. But then along came the geologists, along came the evolutionary biologists like Darwin and said, no, actually the Earth is much older than that. And so suddenly the human time span, the length that our species have been around, suddenly became like an eye blink in a great cosmic story.
If the age of the Earth is the distance from your nose to the tip of your outstretched hand, one stroke of a nail file erases human history.
I think most people that get a sense of this deep time develop what I think of as deep time humility, recognizing, like, who are we to break the great chain of life that goes so far into the past and long into the future? You know, in just a couple of hundred years since the Industrial Revolution, we have wrought incredible havoc and damage on the planet with our fossil fuel economies, with our deadly technologies, and let's liberate ourselves from that. But getting in touch with deep time is really, really difficult. Here is a fossil stone which I collected on the beach with my kids, which is 195 million years old. And you can look at something like this and just get a deep sense of wonder at the expanses of time. And I think this is one of the things we need to do, and I guess also invent new cultural projects which embody the idea of deep time. Like there's the 10,000-year clock, which is being built as we speak inside a limestone mountain in the Texas desert. And it's this clock which is literally designed to last for 10 millennia. And to get there, you're going to be able to hike through the desert for a couple of days to get there, walk up steps, each of them equivalent of 1 million years of geological time, and you'll be able to stand before this kind of secular altarpiece to a long-term thinking civilization. That's the kind of stuff we need to get in touch with.
You know, in my mind, that clock could become a site of pilgrimage like Santiago de Compostela. That's how you change a culture, through things like that. But the really interesting tension within the 10,000-year clock is that the main funder is Jeff Bezos, you know, the guy who invented the buy now button. You couldn't get much more short-term than that. And so I think, you know, that is, in a way, it's a symbol of the kind of struggles that we're in society between the short and the long.
The great thing about human beings is that we die. In other words, we're not going to be here forever. And by the time we reach midlife, we start thinking about the legacy that we're going to leave. How am I going to keep the fire of my own life still burning when I'm gone?
But how? How do you connect to future generations?
It's not that hard. Look, if I think about my own daughter, right? She's 12 years old. Well, she could easily be alive in the year 2100. So I'm imagining my daughter, 90 years old, about to give a birthday speech to family and friends, and suddenly, over on the mantelpiece, she sees a photograph of me, her departed ancestor, and decides to tell the room instead what this person left as a legacy to her and to the world around her. And, you know, I can imagine that. I can bring it back, you know, with my eyes shut, that moment, and it makes my hairs stand on end. Imagining my daughter when she's 19, what she would say about me.
And what would she say about you, Roman?
What would my daughter think about me? I think they'll judge us as carbon criminals. Roman, Dad, you spent all of the 1990s and the 1980s taking aeroplanes all over the world. She might look back even at the house that we live in and think, do we really need to live in such a big house that use so much energy? Why did it take so long to get rid of our car? She might criticize me for those kinds of things. If I care about my daughter's life when she's 90 years old, I can't just think about her because she's not like floating in space. She's part of a web of, community of people who support her, but also the web of the living world. The air she breathes, the water she drinks, the food she eats. So if I care about her life, I need to care about all life. And there's the trick, because what you're doing is making a step from a familial sense of legacy to something a bit more universal or transcendent. That's how you develop a legacy mindset.
Hear our voice.
¿Qué pienso yo acerca del mundo? ¿Y qué deberíamos hacer? ¿Qué deberíamos escuchar? Y ahora yo me digo, no es acerca del mundo, porque las plantas, los minerales no han olvidado quiénes son. Los animales en su capacidad también, cada uno en su capacidad, no han olvidado quiénes son. Los humanos sí hemos olvidado quiénes son.
As long as 50% of the world's population is being oppressed and not allowed to express their full potentiality, there will not be solutions not only to the climate issue, but to world peace. Because it's directly the way we treat women as a human family is a direct reflection of how we're treating Mother Earth.
When the Mother Earth gets sick, we get sick.
So the message is to be considering that ancient wisdom is relevant in modernity. It is relevant now, that this wisdom, these laws, this knowledge is indigenous science, which must be factored in to the way that we start to do business differently with our planet.
Be the generation that said, no, enough.
The comedian Groucho Marx once said, "Why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me?" And I think intuitively a lot of people feel that. Like, I've got enough of my own problems now. I'm dealing with the impacts of a pandemic, or I've lost my job, whatever it is. And I totally understand that feeling. But when you think about it, I think we do have moral responsibilities to the generations to come. And so you can turn to indigenous cultures. You can turn to the Native American idea of seventh generation decision making.
Business as usual is over. It's over. You can't do what you've been doing. Just can't. Earth doesn't need us. Doesn't need us at all. But we need the Earth. And leaders have to take a long perspective. You've got to take that 7-generation perspective. Because if you take care of the future 7 generations from now, you yourself will have peace. If you're protecting the future, then you're protecting yourself now. And you benefit immediately by that.
In Japan, the movement for local government decision-making called future design is directly influenced by the Iroquois idea of 7th generation decision-making.
というような夢と希望がいっぱい出てくるということで、やがては年金もなくなって町の私が全部で住みやすくなったり。
This is a movement where local people are invited to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live, but they're typically split into 2 groups. Half of them are told they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these ceremonial robes to wear, a bit like kimonos, really, and told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060.
自動化活発してきて、今 AI とかも出てきてるので、自分ともう一人同じ自分の AI ができていて、AI が仕事をして私たちは遊ぶ。そういったことができるんじゃないかな。
And it turns out that when imagining themselves as residents from 2060, they come up with much more radical plans for the towns and cities, whether it's healthcare investment or climate change action or dealing with artificial intelligence. We can find time rebels all over the place. In Wales, for example, there's a Future Generations Commissioner. Her name's Sophie Howe. Her job is to look at the impact of public policy 30 years into the future.
The Future Generations Act is already making a difference to the way we reject old road building schemes, to the way we think about planning and designing our communities around a sense of place rather than just infrastructure popping up anywhere, to the way that we educate our children in school through the new curriculum, and through individual decisions that have been taken at a local level every day. There's never been a more important time or a better time to reset, to change the ways we do things, to focus on making things better for the future. This is just some of the vision of the Wales that we want to see, a vision which is already set out in our groundbreaking piece of legislation, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act.
These are all people engaged in a time rebellion. And you see young people on the streets, like my kids, joining the Fridays for Futures marches. Well, they're time rebels, of course. They are absolutely engaged in intergenerational justice.
In this election, you vote for the future living conditions for humankind. It will take courage to lay the foundations where we may not know all the details about how to shape the ceiling. In other words, it will take cathedral thinking.
It's an imaginary city. It doesn't have like flying castles or anything, so it's a normal city. It doesn't exist in real life. It's set in Canada on the southeast part of Hudson Bay.
When you're doing that, are you imagining what kind of buildings are there? Like, is that residential or shops or?
Well, sometimes I do, like, there's an area around here which is meant to be like embankment. This place is probably more residential, I guess.
Is this city one that exists today, or is it a future city or a city from medieval times? What's going on?
It's a city today. I've used a lot of different cities. Like, that is part of Mumbai. This island is actually Singapore.
What are all those darkened bits?
They're skyscrapers. There's more of a financial district here and here.
So if you could live anywhere here in this city, where would you want to live?
Probably around here because it's right by the sea. Not far from the centre, you've got a park, a lake.
Kind of nice. What about, wait a second, is that a football stadium?
No, that's a prison.
A prison, okay, right. I don't want to be anywhere near the prison.
Yeah, there's a football stadium there, and there's one there, and one there.
It reminds me actually of when we went to Barcelona to visit
Camp
Nou and watch the football, where you wanted to watch the football, but I wanted to go to the Sagrada Familia.
We went to both.
We went to both, but it was
Both
pretty
good.
cool, the Sagrada Familia, because that's
Very long time.
very long term, right? Because they started building it, Gaudi started building it in, I can't remember, the 1880s, 1882 or something. But it still hasn't been finished. The cathedral thinking is all about the idea of embarking on projects with very long time horizons, stretching decades and maybe centuries into the future. But you can go to the Netherlands and you can find that kind of cathedral thinking culture as well. Just think about the dikes and the water management boards that have been looking after them really for hundreds of years. That's an incredible form of long-term thinking that we need to celebrate. This is an idea of thinking incredibly long-term, unlike the obsession with progress that came out of the Enlightenment and people like Steven Pinker, who thinks we can keep growing our economies forever, bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, look, nothing in nature grows forever, whether it's the Amazon rainforest or your children's feet. We can't just keep pouring concrete. That's not the kind of cathedral thinking we need. In fact, I think we've got enough cathedrals, but we need the long-termism of cathedral thinking. We need to rewild the landscapes, get rid of the monocultures, bring back the trees. You know, that's a cathedral thinking project as much as it was to actually lay the stones of a basilica in Spain. Long-term thinking isn't always good for you. It's something that needs to be combined with a set of values which are about more than just creating a long-term future for a very narrow community or nation or race or country. ultimately being a good ancestor has to be something pretty universal. It's got to cross borders. It's got to cross religions and ethnic groups. You know, it's got to be much bigger than me and much bigger than just my own local community. But it's very tempting, isn't it, to think, oh, wouldn't it be nice if a lovely, benign dictator, an enlightened despot could just come along and sort out all our problems for us, just make those big decisions to start rationing carbon and putting up carbon taxes, deal with all the biodiversity loss and start planting trees all over the place and just change the laws in order to make all those things happen. Imagine if we were a little bit more like China. They're really good at long-term planning. Look at their long-term plans for solar panels everywhere and for artificial intelligence and all these kinds of things. So, yeah, we like to dream of a kind of God with a big beard who can do it all for us, make all the decisions for us. And I've been tempted by that idea too. When I look at those politicians in parliaments around the world arguing with each other, just worried about their careers, I just think like, oh, it makes me pull out my hair. So I decided to really look into this issue seriously. Because I used to be a political scientist, I asked myself, I guess quite a empirical, analytical question, is it actually true that autocratic governments perform better when it comes to dealing with long-term problems, with long-term public policy? Because I think our knee-jerk reaction is, yeah, of course they're much better. But actually, I discovered that that's not true. The evidence just isn't there. Authoritarian governments aren't responsive to the problems around them necessarily. Often they're just trying to hold on to power, so they're not necessarily engaged in trying to deal with problems that they're facing, like ecological problems. They can just ignore them if they want to, in the same way that the Soviet Union ignored its ecological tragedies for decades that they knew were going on. In fact, the Chinese government was doing it for a long, long time, and they've still got this conflict between constant economic growth and apparently trying to create what they call an ecological civilization. That doesn't mean that democracies are perfect by any means. Order! 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 In whatever country you live in, if you live in a democracy of some kind, you can still see unbelievably insane short-termism going on all the time. So the real question for me then is, okay, let's work with democracy as the main model for political change for long-termism rather than with autocracy. But let's try and be smart in redesigning democracy for a longer now. I certainly don't think of myself as a techno-optimist, thinking that technology is going to solve all of our problems. In fact, look through human history, all technologies, at least the most important ones, have had good sides and bad sides. Yeah, the Industrial Revolution, absolutely amazing. It brought us the doubling of human longevity within 100 years. It brought us amazing conveniences of life. But it also brought us the burning of the planet. It brought us the destruction of our ecology that we depend on. It brought us the great acceleration, pushing us outside the boundaries of the planet. So we need to be very wary about technology. Now, I absolutely think we should be doing all sorts of research on technologies that could possibly help us. Yeah, let's research carbon capture and storage. Let's research fourth-generation nuclear. Let's have a look at geoengineering, but let's not put all of our eggs in one basket and think that we can keep on trashing the planet, crossing our fingers that the technology will save us in the end. There is no evidence that we can develop the technologies that we need fast enough to solve all the problems that we have. And not just think that some clever technology from Silicon Valley is going to solve all our problems for us. I think as a species, we need to think about what is our great transcendent goal. What are we ultimately trying to achieve with all of our long-term thinking? We need a lodestar to guide us. It's about recognizing that if you want to think really long-term, don't just think about extending your horizon in time. You also have to think about place, about rediscovering and regenerating place. You know, how have other species survived and thrived for 10,000 generations or more? Well, it's by taking care of the place that will take care of their offspring, by living within the boundaries of the ecosystem in which they're embedded. They don't foul the nest. We are experts at fouling the nest. And I once had this conversation with an astronaut, and he said to me something really interesting. He said, yeah, it was amazing looking at the Earth and seeing how fragile it was, but it was almost more impressive to look the other way, out of the space station, into the blackness of space, and see absolutely nothing. That's when he realized, let's look after the blue-green marble. Then you've got people like Elon Musk who says, the great aim for our species, the big transcendent goal should be colonizing other worlds. Let's go to Mars. That's the real future for humankind. Any mountaineer going up a very risky peak will always make sure their base camp is in order before they go up that big mountain. Well, we haven't even learned to live within the boundaries of base camp Earth. We haven't even done that yet, and I think that really is our ultimate goal.
Our economies are so focused on growth. What new ways are there to think about this, and how does it connect to being a good ancestor?
I think it's totally obvious that we need to have new economic models to replace our addiction to growth. So what models are out there? Well, I have to admit that there is a model that always comes to my mind because it was invented by my partner, Kate Rayworth, and it's called the donut of social and planetary boundaries. The economics of being a good ancestor is about getting into the donut, above the social foundation, inside the ecological ceiling, into what Kate calls the safe and just space for humanity. This is the opposite of the quest for constant economic growth. It's about thriving in balance. Just a sec. I'm listening.
So for our children to thrive in the future, we have to be building a thriving society, community, world. Otherwise, they've no chance of thriving. You can't thrive alone. You can't thrive behind security fences.
In a way, I'd say that often it's the most privileged people that have the most narrow view of being a good ancestor. The idea like, okay, I'm some aristocrat and I want to pass on my house just to my children or my grandchildren. I don't care about anybody else in the future as long as I secure the legacy for my own family bloodline. Well, that's a really, I think, myopic way of being a good ancestor and thinking long term.
If you have the privilege to own a car, to own your house, if you have the privileged choice to send your children to private school, if that's what you're thinking of doing, or to fly on your holidays, take responsibility for that privilege and act. And let go of things. And you now have the privilege to let go. And other people don't have that privilege, and therefore make sure that you are not replicating and reinforcing your privileges. So move your money out of that high double-digit return investment fund you've got it in and put it in actually something invests in social value and social housing and in your local community, and take a lower return and reinvest that privilege that you may have inherited or created through wealth and reinvest it in the community. So if you're privileged, act on it.
Should we go and find this tree then? Are we ready?
Yep.
From here.
God, it's like a cave.
That is huge. So big.
Imagine if you could see life in a time lapse, but a tree time lapse. So the tree would just be slowly growing, and you'd see humans expanding, war, kings in, kings out, kings back. And this tree all this time has just been here.
Well, the bark's really interesting because there's just so many colours. There's a big hole there. You can actually climb through it.
You know, I was just thinking, Cass, you know, if you have children or grandchildren, you know, they could be alive when this tree's still alive, but you'll be dead, I might be dead.
I think you'll be dead.
I'll definitely be dead.
Yeah. And this tree will keep on going.
I do think that when I die, I want to be my ashes burnt and maybe put in underneath this tree.
I'm not sure that's legal, but we'll see what we can do.
That's the way we can actually live longer in a way. Imagine if the roots draw up nutrients from our own ashes.
You become part of an 1,000-year-old being. So
See,
your
this-
life carries on in another living being.
You know, if you think about how societies change, you can think, okay, let's change the political institutions. That's one way. Or you can change your economic system. That's another way. But there's a third way, which is absolutely vital, which is changing the culture. And by culture, I mean the kinds of worldviews, the Weltanschauung that people have, the assumptions and beliefs, the way people look at the world. And those ideas have always been really fundamental. So we've always been burdened by the cultures that we've inherited. So the idea, for example, that men are superior to women, or that humans are separate from nature, these are part of the cultural inheritance or baggage that we have. And if you want to create a society for time rebellion, which is full of good ancestors, people thinking long term, well, we need to change the cultural ideas that we're swimming in, that we're breathing. We need something more than just politics or economics. We need a closer, more integrated spiritual connection with the earth.
Just do that. Let's take care. Let's go, go, go.
Ah, why did I do that? No, then we can't
I
castle
have
safely.
no idea why you
Okay,
did
you'll
that.
go.
Well, you can castle safely.
So we should take the night.
Take the night.
Take the night.
No, but we're going to lose that. Well, now we've got no nights left.
In an ideal world, we would all be asking ourselves a simple question every day. How can I be a good ancestor? And in that sense, ultimately, we can all be time rebels. We can join this movement when we go shopping and decide, when I'm buying some beans which have been flown in an airplane from Kenya, do I really want to buy these beans? What would a good ancestor do? Well, an act of time rebellion is maybe to put them down because you know that they've expended fossil fuels to come into your nice little corner shop. The time rebellion is waiting to explode, and I really believe that in the next, maybe the next 2 or 3 decades, these struggles for long-term thinking and intergenerational justice, we will have recognized a new kind of movement in the same way that the trade union movement emerged in the 19th century, or the movement for women's rights emerged in the early 20th century. The 21st century is the age of intergenerational justice. It's the age of the rights of the citizens of tomorrow.